Snow fell slow that morning, like ashes drifting from some far-off fire, the kind you never saw but could smell in the air. She stood in the yard with bare hands, shaking the laundry one last time before pinning it to the line, her breath leaving clouds in the bitter air. The boards of the porch behind her groaned with age, each creak a reminder of a house that had seen too much cold and too little laughter. Her little girl ran along the fence line in boots 2 sizes too big, chasing a wind that bit harder than play could soften. The woman's fingers ached from the wet cloth, but she kept working, her eyes on the sky as if the snow might stop if she willed it. She was 23 and already knew what it meant to be old in ways the calendar couldn't measure. She had buried a husband who drowned in a river crossing when the thaw came too fast one spring. She had taken in the hollow silence of widowhood and filled it with the sound of her daughter's voice. From the cabin doorway came the slow, measured steps of a man. He was broad-shouldered and heavy in the jaw, his face weathered by wind but not softened by it. Her stepbrother. He had lived in this house long enough to claim it without words, long enough for his shadow to lie over every board and beam. His voice was low, the kind that didn't need to raise itself to be felt. "You've a good morning for drying," he said, though the frost in his tone made it sound like anything but a kindness. She didn't look at him. The cloth in her hand snapped in the wind. "The cold will freeze it before it dries." He leaned against the post, watching her like he watched the sky for storm signs. "Man came through last night. Trader from out east. Carries fine goods, things worth having." She kept her eyes on the line, though a knot tightened in her chest. Her stepbrother rarely spoke of travelers unless there was something in it for himself. "White horsehair," he went on, as if the words themselves were rare coin. "Good for bowstrings, for trimming a man's hat. He's got sugar too. Tobacco. Cloth finer than you'll see here again before spring." The wind shifted. She caught the faint scent of whiskey on him and knew he had been in the tavern that morning. "And what's that to me?" His gaze slid past her to where her daughter was chasing the wind along the fence, her cheeks flushed with cold. "Not to you. To me." It was then she turned, her hands still gripping the frozen linen. There was a glint in his eye she had seen before, on the day he took her father's cabin after her mother's burial, on the day he sold the mule without asking. It was a look that meant something was already decided, whether she knew it or not. "I made a trade," he said. The words landed like a cold stone in her gut. She didn't ask for details, some truths were better left unspoken, but he told her anyway, as if saying it aloud would make it more solid. "The horsehair, some coin, and a sack of sugar. For you and the girl. He'll take you to town at first light." Her breath caught, a tremor of disbelief passing through her. "You sold us?" His jaw tightened. "Don't speak it like that. You've no means. No land. The man's got work for you, a roof over your head. Better than freezing here." She glanced toward her daughter, who had stopped running and now stood with her mittened hands on the fence, watching a black bird lift into the sky. The girl's hair caught the light, fine as flax, and the thought of someone else claiming her set a deep, slow fire in the woman's chest. "You've no right," she said softly. "I've every right," he answered, his voice a flat stone skipping once before sinking. "You live in my house. Eat my food. That right was bought the day your ma died." The wind seemed to howl sharper then, curling under her coat and around her ribs. She wanted to argue, to throw the frozen cloth at him, but she knew the truth of her position. The law, the town, even the cold, they'd all stand behind him before they stood with her. The next morning came gray and heavy with snow. She dressed her daughter in the warmest clothes they had, though the boots still flopped around her small feet. The trader waited by the fence with a wagon, his breath pluming from under a wide-brimmed hat. The stepbrother stood beside him, the horsehair coiled in his hands like spun moonlight. The trader's eyes swept over her and the child in a way that made her skin tighten. Without a word, he motioned to the wagon. She lifted her daughter onto the bench and climbed up beside her, feeling the boards under her legs, cold and rough. Her stepbrother didn't say goodbye. He simply turned, the coil of horsehair tucked under his arm, and walked back toward the house as if shutting a door. The wagon wheels bit into the snow as they moved down the track, the sound of each turn a reminder of how far from home they were already. The town lay miles ahead, hidden by hills and drifting white, but she could feel it waiting for her, hard-eyed, sharp-tongued, the kind of place that measured people by what they could be used for. Her daughter leaned against her side, small hand slipping into hers. "Will we still have a home?" the girl asked. The woman didn't answer. The truth was too cold to speak, and besides, the wind would have carried it away. Instead, she held her child's hand tighter and fixed her eyes on the road, telling herself that somewhere ahead, something better than this must be waiting. But in her bones, she knew the man driving the wagon hadn't bought them to give them a better life. He had bought them because he could. And the snow kept falling, quiet as ash, covering every track behind them. The wagon rolled into town under a sky the color of pewter, the air so cold it seemed to scrape the inside of the lungs. Snow clung to the edges of the buildings, to the warped planks of porches where men stood with hands in their pockets, watching the road as though the wind itself might bring them news. Her daughter sat pressed against her side, silent now, the wonder gone from her eyes. The trader drove without speaking, the brim of his hat low over his brow. His coat smelled faintly of leather and something sharper, an odor that reminded her of varnish and long-closed rooms. When the wagon stopped, it was in the center of the town square, a patch of open ground ringed by storefronts and sheds. Horses stood hitched in a crooked line along the street, their breath rising in heavy clouds. Men began to gather as soon as the wagon halted, their boots crunching in the packed snow. They looked at her the way one might look at a mule for sale, measuring, calculating. No one spoke to her. The trader stepped down, unhurried, and began talking in a low, steady voice to those closest. She caught only fragments: strong back, young, the girl comes with her, easy to manage. An older woman sat at a table nearby, her lap covered by a wool blanket. She was selling biscuits from a basket, the steam rising in little curls that caught in the sunlight. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that brief glance the woman's gaze held something, pity, perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The crowd thickened. Some faces were coarse with drink, others simply hard from too many winters. Her daughter shifted, gripping the fabric of her skirt. The trader began to speak louder, laying out a price as though reciting a fair bargain. The sound carried across the square, stirring low murmurs among the men. She kept her eyes down, watching the way their boots scuffed at the frozen ground. One pair stepped closer than the rest, a scuffed brown pair, the leather well-oiled, dusted with fine snow. The man wearing them didn't push forward like the others. He stood still, hands in the pockets of a long coat, his hat pulled low so she couldn't quite see his face. But she felt his gaze, steady and unblinking, a presence that somehow quieted the noise of the square. The trader called out another price, a touch sharper this time. One man laughed and made a crude remark about the 2-for-1 offer. Laughter rippled through part of the crowd, thin and mean. Her daughter's fingers tightened around hers until it almost hurt. And then, without warning, the man with the snow-dusted boots stepped forward. His voice was low but it carried clean through the air, cutting the trader's words short. "She's my wife." The trader blinked, caught between confusion and annoyance. "Don't see your name on any paper," he said, his tone turning hard. "Don't need a paper," the man replied, his gaze fixed on her now. "She's my wife, and the girl's mine too. That's all there is." A hush spread, the kind that comes when something shifts beneath the surface of things. The trader's jaw worked, but he seemed to weigh the eyes on him and the rifle slung across the man's back. He spat into the snow, muttering under his breath, then stepped aside with a shrug meant to look indifferent. The man approached her slowly, as though giving her time to pull away if she wished. He stopped just close enough that the smell of cold pine and worn leather reached her. "Come on," he said, quiet enough for only her and the girl to hear. His tone wasn't a question. It wasn't a command either, it was something else, something steadier. She hesitated only a moment before lifting her daughter down from the wagon. The girl clung to her coat as they followed him, the crowd parting to let them pass. She felt their eyes on her back, felt the weight of speculation and judgment, but none dared speak above a whisper. The man led them out of the square, past the horses and the shuttered windows, toward the road that edged into the pine woods. His stride was easy, unhurried, as though there was nothing unusual about walking away with a stranger in full view of the town. Behind them, the trader's voice rose again, already turning his attention to some other deal. But in that square, something had broken loose, not just the sale, but the way her life had been bound to the stepbrother's bargain. She didn't know what the man intended or why he had claimed her, but the sound of his voice still echoed in her mind, clean and certain against the cold. And with each step away from the square, the air seemed to change, though the snow kept falling just as before. The road beyond the town narrowed, the snow lying deeper here where the wind could not sweep it clean. The man walked ahead at first, his boots breaking a path, the sound muffled beneath the pines. She kept her daughter close, the child's mittened hand tucked into hers. Neither of them spoke, and yet the silence between them did not feel sharp, it felt like a space that might hold something if given time. After a mile or so, he slowed until they walked side by side. The brim of his hat shielded most of his face, but in the dim winter light she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the weather's mark on someone who had lived with it rather than fought it. He asked if they were warm enough, his voice carrying no edge, no assumption. She nodded, though the cold was seeping through her boots. The trees thickened, the road curving until a small cabin came into view. It was set against the slope of a pine ridge, smoke rising in a thin ribbon from the chimney. The logs were dark with age, the roof layered with snow that gleamed against the shadowed woods. He pushed the door open and stepped aside for them to enter. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of wood smoke and something faintly sweet. A kettle hung over the fire, and a small table stood against the wall, its surface worn smooth. The girl's eyes went wide at the sight of a shelf filled with books, the spines leaning against one another like old friends. Beside them, in a glass jar, a scatter of marbles caught the firelight and sent it glimmering across the room. He unbuttoned his coat and hung it by the door, then knelt to unlace his boots. "You can put your things there," he said, nodding toward a bench. She hesitated before loosening her own boots, the leather stiff from the cold. While the girl explored the marbles, he poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Haven't got tea," he said, "but it's hot." She took it, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers before she drank. They did not speak much through the afternoon. He brought in wood from the pile outside, split a few more logs, and set them by the hearth. She found flour in a tin and began kneading dough, her hands working without thought, the rhythm familiar. At one point she caught him watching her from the chair near the fire, not in the way the men in the square had looked, but with a quiet attentiveness, as though seeing something worth remembering. Her daughter sat on the floor rolling the marbles between her palms, their clicking the only sound for a time. The cabin seemed to draw its own boundary against the world outside, holding them in a space where the wind's howl could not reach. As evening settled, he lit a lamp and set it on the table. The light softened the sharpness of his features. She wanted to ask why he had claimed her, what risk he had taken in doing so, but the words felt too heavy for the moment. Instead, she asked if he lived alone. He nodded. "Cabin was my father's. Been here since I was a boy. Folks are gone now." The bread finished baking, filling the cabin with a warmth richer than the fire could give. They ate simply, bread, a bit of dried meat, and the last of the hot water. The girl fell asleep on the bed tucked in the corner, her hair spread over the pillow like pale thread. It was then, with only the crackle of the fire between them, that he spoke again. "You don't owe me anything." She looked up, the words catching her off guard. He didn't avert his eyes, didn't shift in his chair. It was a simple truth laid on the table, nothing asked in return. For the first time since her stepbrother had told her of the trade, the tightness in her chest eased just enough for her to take a deeper breath. She still didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but here, in the quiet of the pine-shadowed cabin, it didn't feel like something she had to fear alone. Outside, the snow began again, tapping softly at the window as though the night meant to remind them it was still there. She watched the flakes drift past the lamplight and wondered how long this safety could last, and what price the world might yet demand for it. The night was deep when the sound came, hooves, muffled by snow but too many to be chance. She woke instantly, her breath caught, the weight of the silence between each beat of the hoofsteps pressing against her chest. In the bed across the room, her daughter stirred, but did not wake. The man was already on his feet, pulling on his coat, the lamplight glinting off the iron of his rifle. "They've come," he said quietly, not as a warning but as a certainty. She didn't ask who. She already knew. Outside, the air was sharp enough to burn the lungs. The moon hung behind a veil of thin clouds, its light spilling silver across the snow. 3 riders emerged from the dark pines, their shapes shifting against the trees like restless shadows. The one in front she recognized instantly, the trader, his hat pulled low, his coat collar high. He reined his horse at the edge of the clearing. "You've got something that belongs to me," he called, his voice cutting through the cold. The man stepped forward into the moonlight, rifle easy in his hands, his boots crunching against the crust of ice. "No one belongs to you." The trader's laugh was short, ugly. "Paper says different. Paid good coin for her and the girl. I aim to take what's mine." From behind him, one of the hired men shifted in the saddle, the faint glint of metal catching on the man's hip. She moved to the doorway, the chill seeping through her dress, but she didn't step back inside. Her eyes stayed on the man standing between her and the riders. "Paper's worth nothing when it's written on a lie," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. The trader leaned forward in the saddle. "I'm not here to argue law." His hand lifted, slow, signaling the others. The first shot cracked the stillness apart. It came from one of the hired men, the muzzle flash flaring bright against the night. Snow from a low branch sifted down in a silver curtain. The man returned fire in a single, measured shot. The rider jerked backward, a startled cry tearing the quiet before he toppled from his horse. The second man kicked his mount forward, shouting, but the man at the cabin moved with the certainty of someone who had faced this before. 2 more shots rang out, and the second rider wheeled away, clutching his shoulder, his horse disappearing into the trees. The trader sat frozen for a moment, eyes narrowing in the dim light. Then he spat into the snow, just as he had in the square, and turned his horse without another word. His retreating figure vanished into the dark, leaving only the sound of hooves fading down the ridge. The clearing fell quiet again, the cold settling heavier now that the violence had passed. She realized she had stepped outside without knowing it, her feet sinking into the snow beside him. His breath rose in clouds, steady despite the fight. "You didn't have to," she began, but he shook his head. "Yes, I did." The truth of it settled in her bones, warm against the cold. Behind them, the girl stood in the doorway, her small hands gripping the frame. When she saw him, she let go and crossed the snow at a run, her arms wrapping tight around his leg. He rested a hand gently on her back, his eyes meeting hers over the child's head. "I'm tired of running," she said softly. "Then we stop," he answered. They went back inside, the door closing against the night. He stoked the fire until the shadows drew back, and the warmth filled every corner. They sat together at the table, bread between them, the girl leaning sleep-heavy against her. Outside, the snow began again, falling steady, covering the churned tracks in the clearing. The world beyond the cabin would keep its hunger and its claims, but for this night, they were beyond its reach. And somewhere deep inside, where fear had lived for too long, a small, fierce knowing began to grow, that in a land where even the wind could take you, it was no small thing to find a place where you could stay, and no small thing to be someone's place to stay.